since I'm waiting on parts right now, waiting to get my swap back together, I figured I would make a video that's kind of filling a void in the Ecotec community. I'm going to try and help the people that want to do these swaps as much as possible. I did a ton of reading, a lot of research, a lot of fact checking, because there happens to be a lot of misinformation on these. So I'm hoping to dispel some of those things. I'm hoping to save some time for people that are doing these swaps, and I'm hoping to encourage them, because this is a pretty cool swap for not a lot of money. And if you happen to need a new engine like I did, which is why this one is on the stand, it's actually a Saab BO207R engine, the factory turbocharged Saab engine. It's a very economical swap, and it doesn't have the it's doesn't have the allure of a K swap necessarily. It doesn't hit hard like a K swap or an LS swap, but they're very potent swaps for the money, in my opinion. So I'm gonna just work from the front of the engine to the back, and then back to the transmission, and I'm going to pass along as much information as I can. I'm hoping this will kind of help people that are doing the same swap that I did. After this is back together, I'm planning on selling the car. I'm planning on doing another project, which I'm really excited about. But that doesn't mean that this swap and this car doesn't have a special place in my heart. So let's get to it. You'll see an alternator. The alternator, as far as I know, mounts the same between all of the Ecotecs. This particular one is from an L61. It's actually from an early to mid 2000s Alero. If you look online, you will want to search for the LS one-wire diagram. This is the same exact plug as an LS alternator. So this is running a switched 12-volt source to one specific pin, which is a quick Google search away, with a resistor, which I believe that's like a 460 ohm resistor or somewhere in that ballpark. So I ran a one-wire resistor alternator exciter setup with no issues whatsoever. So as far as I know, all the spacing is the same. All of the non-AC serpentine belts are the same. So this is just a serpentine belt from a Cavalier. Tensioner from a Cavalier. You can get all this stuff from Rock Auto, local parts store, anywhere, basically. Luckily, they made zillions of these cars. So, this is a used harmonic balancer from Pontiac Solstice. The Solstices did come with hydraulic power steering, unbeknownst to me. So this is a used, again, power steering pump from a Pontiac Solstice. Works great. I used an M16 fitting to what I believe is an AN6 JIC fitting or AN fitting. But this thread is an M16, so it's sealed. It's sealed with a crush washer O-ring type deal. Works just fine with the Nissan rack. I just plumbed it exactly the way the Nissan would have plumbed it. The pressure seems to be fine. It didn't have any leaks. Pretty easy. But that's what you're going to want to go to your hydraulic store and ask for, is an M16. Or if you want to go AN route, I prefer not to in this case, because I think, not that AN isn't rated for it, but it's up there. This is rated for like 5,800 PSI or something like that, where AN's rated for like 1,500 PSI, and it's just a bigger margin of error. Lots of people run AN and without any issue. But that's neither here nor there. M16 to M6, and then you could do the same thing to your steering rack or steering box. Is run, if it has a flat surface, you can run a crush washer hydraulic setup where it's not flared, it's just straight threaded and it seals on the crush washer. Yeah, so I got this for like 25 bucks on eBay. Works great, looks brand new. I put less than 5,000 miles on the car this year, probably less than 1,000 even before I had an accident with it. And no complaints. Same with this. I got this for like $75. So you can have a power steering pump for these for like $100. There are lots of places that sell C5 pumps, and whatnot, and that'll be $500, $600, $700 on up, which I'm sure it's a great setup. Certainly the pumps are going to be easier to find if you have to replace it, but I just took a chance on this. I mean, I'm not daily driving this car. I'm not putting 20,000 miles a year on it. It doesn't have to be top of the top, and this is perfectly fine. It actually says Toyota on it, so it's probably a pretty good pump. Next, we'll move over here to the intake side. So when I was running an LSJ head that has an M8 threaded head, an intake manifold has M8 holes in it. I ran an L61 intake on my LSJ with no issues, other than I needed to get M8 to M6 adapter sleeves, which they're a stainless sleeve that has male and female threads. I just put a little blue Loctite on it, and it threads in with a flathead screwdriver. So it's reversible. You can run an M6 or an M8 intake. Something to note about the intakes too, the direct injected intakes don't bolt on to the port injected heads. So just keep that in mind. It takes quite a bit of work to get an LNF intake on an LSJ or a port injected engine. Certainly not impossible. People have done it, but if you kind of want to get it on the road sooner rather than later, just run something else. So the L61 intake, I didn't mind at all. Bolted up fine. I ran 15 PSI through it with no issues. That's pretty much it. And you can get them anywhere. So I think the longer runners may help torque too. Lower end torque. So that's something to keep in mind too. But yeah, 15 PSI, no problem. Here's the fuel rail setup here. As you can see, I'll flip it around. I've got Deca 80s on here. This is a stainless hardline coming off of the intake, or off of the fuel rail rather. And then I do a little bit of reading on this. It's a 3/8 compression fitting to AN. So it's an AN6 to a 3/8 hardline, which is what this is. On the other end here, I've got a banjo fitting to an AN6 as well. And then I've got the over-the-top performance adapter here. I said it before, if you know somebody that can weld aluminum or you can weld it yourself, I would recommend just getting an aluminum bung and just welding it on the rail. Twofold, that'll save you a bit of money, and it'll get you some clearance to the firewall, which is why I had to run this banjo fitting in the first place. And one other thing too is they didn't include an O-ring with this fitting, so I don't know what O-ring size exactly it's supposed to be. So I kind of jammed one in there that was a little too big, but it hasn't leaked. It doesn't leak. It's perfectly fine. But yeah, so another thing to note, some of the people I talked to online that were really knowledgeable in the OEM fuel rail business, it's really tricky to run a return style, or any kind of style rather, fuel system without a return line, without this damper, which is what this does. Stock, what comes here stock is a fuel rail damper. Yeah, I was running 15 PSI of boost, whatever that was, maybe 300 horsepower or so. And to no ill effects, really. Probably should have gotten bigger injectors, but that's not really a big deal. So, on to the next thing. Alrighty, this is kind of where the magic happens on these engines as far as swapping goes. I guess just working from the top. I've got LS coils, which isn't necessary by any means. The LSJ coils. The coil unplug is just fine. As far as settings, I'm running a standalone. I don't see any reason why you couldn't wire up a set of LS coils with a stock computer. They seem to trigger the same. The dwell times are very close. I couldn't tell any difference when I was measuring spark and all that. So, top down, I'd recommend putting a newer style tensioner on these. And while you're in there, I'd recommend just doing the whole timing chain and guides. That seems to be a weak point on these engines. That's the one main thing people are going to gripe about when you tell them you're doing or did an Ecotec swap is the timing chains, which is likely due to lack of maintenance. And there being zillions of these engines on the road that come in extremely neglected vehicles. So, something to keep in mind. It doesn't cost too much to do a timing chain. Yeah. So, yeah, do that. Running a ZZP, exhaust manifold, turbo manifold. Depends if you want to go NA or not. This seems like a really nice piece. It's cast stainless. It's a T3 flange. No issues with it. I will say, if you're running an LSJ or a B207R Saab engine, you need to run that plate. I thought I didn't need to, and I had an exhaust leak, and I couldn't figure out why until I took the engine back apart. That was due to the fact that I believe it has an air injection setup, or the Saab at least did when I took that apart. So that there are two ports on either side of the exhaust port that need to be covered up. That there's just a little pin. There's just a little pinhole, and it's going to make a really nasty whistling noise that you're not going to want after working hard on this project for months probably, or perhaps longer. So run that plate if you get the ZZP manifold. And then I did copper RTV, high temp RTV. Copper though, red, I don't think red's going to withstand that. Going down, a gentleman named Jordan Carter designed this piece. I do have the file available. I'm not selling these. I don't believe he is anymore either. It is a plate that goes over the water block. So I ran an external thermostat on the opposite side of the engine on the water outlet that goes to the radiator. It works pretty well. I drilled a hole in it because the hysteresis on it wasn't hot. The temperature fluctuated too much. It got too hot. Just because the thermostat's so far away from the engine, it doesn't have the block heat to keep it warm. So that's an iffy setup. It works okay. So you have a coolant temperature sensor, your graph, your plotting points or whatever are the same for any GM sensor. The plug is the same as an LS for the coolant temperature sensor. This is something I believe is necessary. It's just an AN line that runs to my coolant pickup here. So obviously you're getting some warm coolant back into the system that's circulating around. It still runs cool, cooler than I'd like actually. But this is pretty much needed. From what I understand, the coolant, I don't know. I actually don't know. I just know it helps. Otherwise, you're trying to force all that coolant through the head gasket. So, otherwise, yeah. So I ran this, which it brings me to the next thing, which is an extremely crucial piece, which nobody makes. It's a very kind of niche crowd that swaps Ecotecs. But all it is an 1.5 or 1.75 or 1.5 you can use too. But this is an 1.75 aluminum pipe that is a U-bend. I cut it down. I had my buddy TIG weld it to the stock water pump cover. Works great. And then you can delete all this stuff that goes around the back of the engine, which will eat up firewall clearance. Coming down here, custom oil pan. You're probably going to need one, unless you're lucky and you're doing an S chassis or something like that, where the sump isn't in the way. This is in a 300ZX where it's very much a rear sump setup. The cross member sat right where the sump was, so I had to just do a custom pan. I do have flanges available if anybody's interested. It's more helping people out. I know this isn't really you know, it's not really a booming swap per se, but there's still plenty of people that want to do it. So yeah, I've got the flange available. I spent a lot of time measuring that. I drew this pan up in CAD, although you can't tell by looking at it anymore. The mount for the power steering pump, as far as I know, is on every Ecotec engine. It's just 3 M10 bolts, regular thread. So this brings us to the rear of the engine. I would recommend running an external oil cooler. The coolant one seems like a good design, and I would have run it because it would theoretically heat up the oil faster and keep it cool at the same, you know, it should keep it fairly regulated. But I'm using the block. I cut off both outlets on it, and I threaded it for 1/2 inch at PT, and then I ran AN10 to a 25 roll air oil cooler. So that works fine as far as I know. I believe this is thermostatically controlled. Could be wrong. It does have a spot for what I believe it might be an oil pressure sensor. I'm not sure. I pulled oil pressure off of somewhere else, off of the block itself. So that's not an issue. They do make external oil filter kits, oil filter relocation kit, I guess it would be called, as well. This is a Saab engine. I put an LSJ block off plate. There must have been a power steering pump on this or something. This is the Saab vacuum pump, I think. The LSJ cam sensor is massive, so that could cause some firewall clearance issues, but not as much as the oil cooler. Biggest things on the back of the engine with a rear wheel drive swap are oil cooler and your coolant system, which I don't know why you'd want to keep that factory coolant system anyway. You're just going to have a ton of plumbing for no reason. Both the inlet and the outlet on the same side. So maybe if you're running a dual pass radiator with both the inlet and outlet on the same side, then you'd want to run that or something. Otherwise, it's kind of an answer without a question. You can't see this down here. The boosted engines, whether it be an LNF or an LSJ or a B207R, all have an 8-bolt asymmetrical flywheel flange. All the other ones, as far as I know, are 6-bolt. So there are 2 different flywheels. This was an LSJ, but I was able to run an LNF aftermarket flywheel, which, by the way, don't get a Fidanza. It's been a headache. It's caused me a lot of issues. The spacing isn't right. So if you get one, just please measure and make sure it's going to work before you put it on. Their tech support's been unresponsive. I'm running a spec clutch. Their tech support's been great. Despite anything else you've heard. Spec has been great. The clutch is great. Hasn't shown anywhere. But that's a bit of a tangent, just something I thought I should point out. So there aren't really many clutches. I'm running a spec stage 2 plus. I maybe ran it 1,000 miles before I took the engine apart. I took the engine back out. I didn't notice much wear at all. So at this point, I can pretty confidently recommend a spec clutch. There's a lot of internet hoopla out there about them. I know there's a lot of mixed reviews, but I can say the one for the Ecotecs are great. I really like their tech support. I would run a spec flywheel as well. They do make a 6-bolt spec flywheel that's for the L61 or LE5 or so on and so forth. The 2.2 or the 2.4. They make a 6-bolt one that you can use the LNF and LSJ clutches with. So for a rear wheel drive, setup, you're gonna have to run an LNF clutch. So even though this is an LSJ, it's got an LNF clutch and flywheel because the input shafts are different. between the AR5 and the whatever the front wheel drive cars run in F40 or F23 or whatever they run. I'm not really too familiar. I'm running a Cobalt clutch, or I'm running a Cobalt starter, which works fine with this flywheel. I think all the Ecotec stuff is pretty interchangeable. I don't think you have to run a specific solstice starter or something. Just keep the starter you have. I would almost guarantee that it'll work fine. One other thing I forgot to add, the older engines seem to run a VR sensor, or a variable reluctance crankshaft position sensor. Most of them are 58X, which if you're running a standalone is a 60-2 wheel. For the LSJ, which as far as I can tell is the only one that's different, your crank trigger offset is going to be in the ballpark of 120 degrees, which if you run a safe timing amount should be enough to get you started and get a timing light on and see exactly where you're at, which you're going to want to do anyway. If you're running a standalone, you probably know that already. Otherwise, the LE5 and the others are an 84 degree offset. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have first-hand experience with that. That's just what I read. Otherwise, the L61, I believe, has a 7X, which is kind of a weird crank trigger. You might want to run an external 36-2 wheel or something like that anyway, as others have done. Again, no experience with that. I'm running a 115 degree offset in this one. It's a 58X. I'm running the factory sensor with no issues. I'm also running a mega squirt. Those settings work just fine. I whooped on this thing pretty hard and never had any detonation or anything. Just something to note. That's another thing that you might bang your head on the wall about, trying to figure out what your crank trigger is if you're running a standalone. I don't think a ton of people are, which is why, I mean, this is another thing too that I did a lot of reading on forums, more than I'd like to care to admit. Hours, probably at least an hour, just pilfering through posts, trying to figure out what people are actually running. And that being said, another thing that threw me for a loop, which is, it sounds dumb now, but I just didn't realize it. When you're wiring a standalone, make sure you wire cylinders 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the ignition in order of the firing. So you would wire 1 to cylinder 1, 2 to cylinder 3, 3 to cylinder 4, and 4 to cylinder 2, or something like that. I think it's 1, 3, 4, 2 is the firing order on these, but I'm just going off of memory. But anyway, do not wire them 1 to cylinder 1, 2 to cylinder 2, and so on and so forth. Wire them to the cylinder that they're firing.
Okay, so this brings us to the transmission portion of the swap. This is an 06 to 07, I believe, Pontiac Solstice transmission. You're going to want the 06 to 07 Solstice transmission because the mounts are on the bottom, whereas the ones after 07 mounted to the differential, so the mounts are more so on the top and side. You might think you can get away with running a slip yoke on this. The drive shaft shop flat out refused to do a drive shaft that was like that. There's only about 2 inches of spline engagement. Otherwise, the output shaft is identical to a 4L60, which is a 27 spline, I believe. I think the same goes for the Colorado transmission, but the input shaft is much different on the Colorado transmission too. So that's something else to keep in mind. That's not something I'm going to get into on this video because I don't have any experience with it. If you're doing the swap, you should be no stranger to looking up internet articles and kind of looking through forum posts. If you want to run a Colorado transmission, I can't really help you there. The Solstice Trans seems like the no-brainer to me. Other than that, I used a Speed Engineering, or I think Drift Motion sells the adapter disc. You can see the bright silver piece between the drive shaft and the transmission. And then the transmission I got custom made at a local shop. It's got a slip joint in the middle. This is an IRS car, so it doesn't need a ton of travel, if any. But your local reputable drive shaft shop shouldn't have any issue making something like that. Other than that, just use the stock Solstice transmission mount. I clearanced it a little bit, as you can see. Not perfect, but it does work well enough. That's about it.